Welcome, dear friends, to this peaceful sanctuary of wisdom and tranquility. As the day draws to a close and darkness gently embraces the world, we invite you to release the burdens of today and open your heart to these sacred parables. These ancient stories have been carefully chosen to guide you toward inner peace, helping your mind settle like still water reflecting the moon. Let these gentle tales wash over you, bringing calm to your spirit and preparing your soul for restorative sleep. Breathe deeply, settle comfortably, and allow these timeless teachings to carry you into serenity. Before the first light of dawn touched the ancient stone walls of the monastery, Brother Marcus was already awake, sitting in perfect stillness in his modest cell. The silence that surrounded him was not empty, but full of presence, thick with the accumulated prayers of countless generations who had walked these corridors before him. His breathing was so quiet it barely disturbed the air, yet each inhalation seemed to draw in the wisdom of ages, each exhalation releasing the burdens of the world. The monastery of San Lorenzo had stood on this hillside for over 800 years, its walls weathered by countless seasons, its foundations rooted deep in both earth and tradition. Brother Marcus had arrived here 23 years ago, a young man tormented by questions that the world outside could not answer. He had come seeking peace, but had found something far more profound. An understanding that peace was not something to be found, but something to be embodied, not a destination, but a way of traveling. His daily routine had remained unchanged for over 2 decades. Before sunrise, he would sit in meditation, allowing his mind to settle like sediment in still water. The thoughts would come and go like clouds across the sky of consciousness, and he would watch them without attachment, neither grasping nor pushing away. This practice had taught him that the mind was like a wild horse that became gentle, not through force but through patient, consistent attention. As the monastery bells began their ancient call to prayer, Brother Marcus rose from his meditation cushion with movements that were both deliberate and effortless. His body had learned the rhythm of this place, the way his feet should fall on the worn stone floors, the precise moment when each door would creak the exact pressure needed to open the heavy wooden gate that led to the garden. The garden was his special responsibility, though he had never been formally assigned to tend it. Years ago, he had simply begun caring for the neglected plot behind the kitchen, and gradually it had transformed into something extraordinary. Not because of any particular horticultural skill, but because he approached each plant, each seed, each season with the same quality of attention he brought to his meditation. This morning, as every morning, he walked among the rows of vegetables and herbs with his hands clasped behind his back, observing without interfering. The tomatoes were beginning to ripen, their green shoulders touched with the first blush of red. The basil had grown thick and fragrant, its leaves heavy with essential oils that would soon flavor the simple meals shared in the monastery refectory. The lettuce had formed perfect heads, each leaf curled around the others in spirals that seemed to echo the mathematical precision of creation itself. Brother Marcus understood that the garden was teaching him something essential about patience and trust. He could prepare the soil, plant the seeds, provide water and protection from pests, but the actual miracle of growth happened without his intervention. The seeds carried within themselves everything they needed to become what they were meant to be. His role was simply to create conditions that would allow their natural potential to unfold. As he completed his circuit of the garden, the sun finally crested the eastern mountains, sending long fingers of golden light across the valley below. The monastery occupied a unique position on the hillside, high enough to catch the first light, but sheltered enough to be protected from the harsh winds that sometimes swept across the peaks. From where he stood, Brother Marcus could see for miles in every direction the valley with its patchwork of farms and vineyards, the river winding like a silver ribbon toward the distant sea, the ancient villages perched on hilltops like birds' nests. The view had the power to put everything in perspective. The concerns and dramas that seemed so urgent from ground level appeared remarkably small when seen from this elevation. Brother Marcus had learned to apply this same perspective to the troubles of the human heart. When anxiety or anger arose, he would imagine himself rising above the immediate situation, viewing it from the broader context of a lifetime, a century, a millennium. After his time in the garden, Brother Marcus made his way to the library, another of his unofficial responsibilities. The monastery's collection of books and manuscripts was extensive, accumulated over centuries by monks who understood that preserving knowledge was a form of spiritual practice. Many of the volumes were rare, some were unique, and all required careful attention to prevent the inevitable decay that came with age. He spent an hour each morning in the library, not reading, but tending. He would check the temperature and humidity levels, dust the shelves with movements as precise as a surgeon's, and inspect individual volumes for signs of deterioration. When he found a book that needed attention, he would take it to his small workshop, where he had learned the ancient arts of bookbinding and paper restoration. The work required absolute focus and infinite patience. A single hasty movement could destroy pages that had survived for centuries. Brother Marcus had learned to slow his breathing, to steady his hands, to work in harmony with the materials rather than imposing his will upon them. In this way, he had saved hundreds of texts from destruction, preserving not just information, but the accumulated wisdom of countless seekers who had walked the path before him. Today, he discovered a manuscript that he had not seen before, tucked behind a row of theological treatises. The leather binding was cracked with age, but the pages inside were remarkably well preserved. It appeared to be a collection of stories, parables, written in an archaic form of Latin that took him some time to decipher. The tales spoke of wisdom gained through surrender, of strength found in gentleness, of the profound teachings that could be discovered in the most ordinary moments of daily life. As he read, Brother Marcus felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the recognition that comes when truth resonates with truth. These stories echoed his own experience, the lessons he had learned through years of patient practice and quiet observation. They spoke of a way of being in the world that was both humble and powerful, grounded in the recognition that true authority comes not from domination, but from alignment with the deeper currents of existence. The morning hours passed without his awareness of time. When the bell rang for the midday meal, he was surprised to find that he had been reading for over 3 hours. He carefully marked his place in the manuscript and returned it to its protective sleeve, but the stories continued to work within him like seeds planted in fertile soil. The refectory was filled with the quiet sounds of communal dining, the gentle clink of simple pottery, the soft footsteps of brothers moving between tables, the barely audible whisper of pages turning, as someone read aloud from the day's selected text. The meal itself was plain, but nourishing soup made from vegetables grown in their own garden, bread baked that morning from grain milled by their neighbors in the valley water drawn from the spring that had supplied the monastery for 8 centuries. Brother Marcus ate slowly, mindfully aware of each flavor and texture. He had long ago learned that the act of eating could be a form of meditation, an opportunity to practice gratitude and presence. Each spoonful of soup carried within it the sun and rain that had nourished the vegetables, the hands that had planted and harvested them, the wood that had burned to cook them. In this way, a simple meal became a communion with the entire web of existence. After lunch, there was a period of rest. Some of the brothers napped, others read, a few worked on personal projects or correspondence. Brother Marcus used this time for what he privately called his walking meditation. He would leave the monastery grounds and follow the ancient path that wound down the hillside toward the valley, walking at a pace that was neither hurried nor lazy, but perfectly suited to the rhythm of contemplation. The path had been worn smooth by centuries of use, first by the shepherds who had grazed their flocks on these slopes, then by the monks who had established the monastery, and finally by the countless pilgrims who had come seeking wisdom or healing, or simply a moment of peace in lives otherwise filled with turmoil. Brother Marcus felt connected to all of them as he walked part of an unbroken chain of seekers stretching back through time. His destination was always the same: a small grove of olive trees about halfway down the hillside, where someone long ago had placed a simple stone bench. The trees were ancient, their trunks twisted and gnarled, but still producing fruit each autumn. They had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the coming and going of countless human dramas, yet they continued to grow toward the light, to put down deeper roots, to offer their gifts to the world without expectation of reward. Brother Marcus would sit on the bench for exactly 1 hour, not because he was watching the time, but because his body had learned to recognize when the period of rest was complete. During this hour, he would simply be present with the trees, the hillside, the vast sky above. Sometimes thoughts would arise, sometimes emotions, sometimes profound insights that seemed to come from beyond his individual mind. He welcomed them all with equal equanimity, understanding that resistance created suffering while acceptance led to wisdom. Years passed, and the village fool, whose name was Chen, continued his nightly ritual at the well. But something had changed since his encounter with the wise traveler. He no longer frantically splashed his bucket through the water, desperately trying to capture the moon's reflection. Instead, he would sit quietly beside the stone rim, watching the celestial orb dance on the water's surface with patient reverence. The villagers noticed this transformation gradually. Where once they had hurried past the well to avoid witnessing what they considered madness, they now found themselves drawn to observe Chen's peaceful vigil. Children who had previously thrown stones to disturb his work began to approach, cautiously curious about this gentle man who seemed to find such joy in something so simple. Chen's understanding had deepened beyond what even the wise traveler had imparted. Through countless nights of contemplation, he had discovered that the moon in the well was not separate from the moon in the sky, just as the light within each person was not separate from the source of all illumination. The water had become his teacher, showing him how perfect stillness could reflect infinite beauty without trying to possess it. During the day, when the moon was invisible, and the well showed only the pale reflection of clouds or the occasional bird passing overhead, Chen would tend to practical matters. He repaired the well's wooden bucket, which had grown worn from his earlier frantic efforts. He cleared away the debris that autumn winds deposited around the stone rim. He ensured the path to the well remained clear for others who came to draw water. These simple acts of maintenance became another form of meditation for Chen. He understood now that caring for the space where beauty could be witnessed was itself a sacred responsibility. The well needed to be clean and accessible, not just for his own contemplation, but for anyone who might need to see their own reflection in its depths. One particularly dark night, when heavy clouds obscured the moon entirely, Chen arrived at the well to find a young woman weeping beside it. She was a stranger to the village, dressed in travel-worn clothes, her face streaked with tears that caught what little starlight penetrated the overcast sky. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, expecting to be told to move along, but Chen simply sat down beside her with the same peaceful presence he brought to his moon watching. Without being asked, the woman began to speak of her troubles. She had lost her way while traveling to a distant city where she hoped to find work. Her small savings had been stolen by bandits, and she felt as lost and empty as the dark well before them. She had stopped here not to drink, but to hide her shame from the world, to weep in solitude where no one would see her failure. Chen listened without offering advice or false comfort. When she finished speaking, he stood and lowered the bucket into the well, drawing up clear, cold water. He offered her a drink, and as she cupped the water in her hands, he lit a small lantern that he had begun carrying for such moments. The flame was tiny, barely strong enough to illuminate their faces, but when its light touched the water's surface, it created a warm, dancing reflection that seemed to fill the entire well with gentle radiance. The woman gasped softly at the beauty of it, and Chen saw in her eyes the same wonder he had first felt when he learned to see the moon's reflection, not as something to be captured, but as something to be witnessed. He extinguished the lantern, but the image of light dancing on water remained in both their minds, a reminder that even the smallest flame could transform darkness into beauty. By dawn, the woman had decided to remain in the village for a while. The villagers, who had learned kindness from watching Chen's patient example, welcomed her with offers of work and shelter. She became the village teacher, sharing stories and knowledge from the many places she had traveled. And often she would bring her students to the well to show them how different kinds of light created different reflections in the water. Chen's influence spread in ways he never intended or expected. Travelers began to seek out the village, specifically to meet the man who found wisdom in a well. Some came as skeptics, expecting to find a simpleton they could easily dismiss. Others arrived as pilgrims, hoping to discover some mystical secret that would transform their lives overnight. To all of them, Chen offered the same simple invitation: sit beside the well and watch. Some visitors grew impatient after a few minutes, convinced they were wasting their time with a madman. Others stayed for hours, gradually understanding that the watching itself was the teaching that presence and patience could reveal truths that no amount of clever thinking could uncover. Among those who stayed was a group of monks from a distant monastery who had heard rumors of the village fool who had learned to see God in a well. They expected to find either a fraud or a genuine mystic, but instead they discovered something far more profound: an ordinary man who had learned to find the sacred in the utterly mundane. The eldest monk, a stern man accustomed to complex theological debates and elaborate spiritual practices, found himself humbled by Chen's simple presence. After 3 days of sitting beside the well, watching the play of light and shadow on the water's surface, the monk realized that all his years of study and meditation had been preparation for this moment of pure seeing, this recognition that the divine was always present and required nothing more than an open heart to perceive it. When the monks finally departed, they carried with them not new doctrines or advanced techniques, but a renewed appreciation for the extraordinary nature of ordinary moments. Back at their monastery, they found themselves approaching their daily practices with a different quality of attention, less concerned with achieving special states of consciousness and more focused on being fully present to whatever was before them. Chen continued his nightly vigils, but he was no longer alone. A small community had grown around the well, people who found peace in shared silence, who discovered that watching together somehow deepened the experience for everyone. They learned from each other's presence, from the different ways each person reflected the same truth, like facets of a jewel, each catching and returning the same light in their own unique way. Elias had spent the better part of 15 years accumulating knowledge like a merchant hoards gold. His personal library contained over 3,000 volumes on philosophy, theology, psychology, and metaphysics. He could recite entire passages from Aristotle, debate the finer points of Kant's categorical imperative, and explain the differences between various schools of Buddhist thought with the precision of a master craftsman. His reputation as a scholar had spread throughout the region, and universities regularly invited him to deliver lectures on enlightenment and the pursuit of wisdom. Yet, despite all his learning, Elias felt increasingly restless. There was something missing from his understanding in some essential element that remained elusive despite his extensive studies. He had read about enlightenment, analyzed it, categorized it, and written extensively about it, but somehow the actual experience of it remained frustratingly distant. This growing sense of incompleteness drove him to seek out teachers and masters wherever they might be found. When word reached him of a tea master living in the mountains who was said to possess extraordinary wisdom, Elias immediately made plans to visit. The journey would take 3 days by foot along winding mountain paths, but Elias relished the opportunity to finally meet someone who might appreciate the depth of his knowledge and perhaps provide the missing piece to his intellectual puzzle. The tea master's dwelling was remarkably simple, almost austere. A small wooden house with paper screens surrounded by a carefully tended garden where bamboo rustled in the mountain breeze. Elias had expected something more impressive, perhaps a grand temple or at least a residence that reflected the master's supposed wisdom. Nevertheless, he approached with confidence, ready to engage in the kind of philosophical discourse that had made him famous in academic circles. From the moment he stepped through the doorway, Elias began speaking. He discussed the nature of consciousness as understood by Western philosophers, compared it to Eastern concepts of enlightenment, and outlined his own theories about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. He quoted extensively from memory, his voice growing more animated as he warmed to his subject. The tea master listened without interruption, his hands moving with practiced grace as he prepared the traditional tea service. Elias barely noticed the meticulous care with which the master handled each implement. The way he warmed the pot with precise movements, measured the tea leaves with reverent attention, heated the water to exactly the right temperature. These details seemed insignificant compared to the important philosophical points Elias was making. He continued his monologue, explaining how his studies had led him to understand the fundamental nature of reality and the various paths to spiritual awakening. The scholar's discourse ranged across centuries of human thought. He spoke of Plato's cave allegory and how it related to Buddhist concepts of illusion. He explained Descartes' methodical doubt and its connection to the meditation practices of various contemplative traditions. He outlined his personal synthesis of these diverse streams of wisdom, a comprehensive framework that he believed could guide anyone toward enlightenment. As he spoke, Elias felt increasingly pleased with his performance. The tea master's quiet attention seemed to indicate deep respect for his knowledge. Surely, this simple mountain dweller had never encountered such breadth of learning, such sophisticated understanding of complex spiritual concepts. Elias began to imagine how grateful the master must be to receive such valuable teachings, how this encounter would undoubtedly enhance the master's own limited understanding. The tea was ready now, its fragrance filling the small room with subtle complexity. The master poured carefully, the golden liquid flowing in a perfect arc from pot to cup. Elias continued talking, even as the cup filled, barely registering what was happening. He was in the middle of explaining his theory about the relationship between intellectual understanding and direct experience when the tea reached the rim of his cup, but the master did not stop pouring. The tea overflowed, spilling across the low wooden table and dripping onto Elias's carefully pressed robes. Still the master continued, his expression serene and untroubled, as if nothing unusual was occurring. The hot tea soaked through the expensive fabric, spreading across Elias's lap in a warm, uncomfortable wetness. Finally, Elias's scholarly composure cracked. He jumped up from his seated position, his voice rising in alarm as he demanded that the master stop this seemingly senseless action. The cup was obviously full, had been full for several seconds. What was the point of continuing to pour when no more liquid could possibly be contained? The tea master set down the pot with the same deliberate care he had shown throughout the entire process. His smile was gentle, containing no mockery or superiority, only a kind of infinite patience that seemed to encompass all of human folly and misunderstanding. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear, cutting through Elias's agitation with simple clarity. The comparison was immediate and devastating in its accuracy. Elias understood instantly what the master meant, felt the truth of it settle into his consciousness like sediment in still water. All his years of accumulating knowledge, all his careful theories and sophisticated explanations had filled him so completely that there was no room for anything new to enter. He had become like an overstuffed container, impermeable to fresh insights or genuine learning. In that moment of recognition, Elias felt something shift inside him. The pride that had driven his scholarly pursuits for so many years suddenly seemed not just unnecessary, but actively harmful. It was as if a dam had burst, allowing the accumulated pressure of his arrogance to drain away, leaving behind a space that was both empty and full of potential. The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge. Elias remained standing, tea still dripping from his robes, but his attention had turned inward. He saw with startling clarity how his attachment to being known as wise had prevented him from actually becoming wise. His need to demonstrate his knowledge had created a barrier between himself and the very understanding he sought. Slowly, he sat back down, his movements heavy with the weight of this new awareness. The tea master began cleaning up the spilled liquid without any sign of irritation or judgment. His actions were simply practical responses to the situation at hand, neither dwelling on what had happened nor anticipating what might come next. Elias found himself watching these simple movements with fascination. There was something profound in the way the master attended to each small task with complete presence. No movement was wasted, no gesture contained self-consciousness or performance. It was as if the master existed in perfect harmony with whatever the moment required, responding appropriately without the interference of ego or agenda. For the first time in years, Elias remained quiet for an extended period. He sat in the growing stillness, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of not knowing what to say next. His mind, usually so quick to analyze and categorize every experience, seemed to have settled into a different mode of operation. Instead of immediately trying to understand what was happening, he simply allowed himself to experience it. The master prepared a fresh cup of tea this time, pouring only enough to fill it properly. He offered it to Elias with the same graceful movements he had used throughout their encounter. When Elias accepted the cup, he noticed details that had escaped his attention before: the warmth of the ceramic against his palms, the complex aroma rising with the steam, the precise color of the liquid itself. As he drank, Elias tasted not just tea, but something else entirely. Each sip seemed to carry with it a lesson about presence, about the difference between experiencing something directly and merely thinking about it. The flavor was subtle and layered, requiring attention rather than analysis to fully appreciate. He found himself slowing down, allowing each taste to register completely before taking the next sip. When the cup was empty, Elias set it down carefully and looked up to meet the master's eyes. What he saw there was neither judgment nor pity, but a kind of recognition that seemed to acknowledge both his past mistakes and his present potential for growth. It was the look of someone who had walked a similar path and understood the necessity of emptying oneself before true learning could begin. The scholar left the mountain house that afternoon with fewer answers than he had brought, but somehow this felt like progress rather than failure. The journey back to his village passed in contemplative silence, his mind no longer racing to process and categorize every sight and sound. Instead, he found himself simply walking, simply breathing, simply being present to whatever arose in each moment. When he finally reached home, Elias looked at his extensive library with new eyes. The thousands of books that had once been sources of pride now seemed like potential obstacles to genuine understanding. He did not discard them, but neither did he approach them with the same hungry acquisitiveness that had previously driven his studies. Instead, he began reading differently, allowing space between the words for his own direct experience to inform his understanding. In the furthest corner of the monastery garden, where the morning sun filtered through ancient oak leaves and wildflowers grew without human planning, a small caterpillar named Kaya spent her days methodically moving from leaf to leaf. Her world consisted of the immediate territory she could reach with her slow, deliberate movements, the underside of broad leaves where she found shelter from rain, the tender new growth where the sweetest flavors could be discovered, and the network of stems and branches that formed the highways of her existence. Kaya had lived this way for what seemed like countless seasons, though, in reality, it had been only a few weeks since her emergence from the egg. Time moved differently for creatures of her size and perspective. Each day brought the same essential activities: eating, resting, avoiding predators, and slowly growing larger within the confines of her segmented body. She had never questioned this routine, had never imagined that life might hold possibilities beyond the endless cycle of consumption and survival. The caterpillar's understanding of the world was necessarily limited by her physical capabilities. She could not see beyond the immediate vicinity of whatever plant currently supported her weight. The concept of flight was as foreign to her as the ability to breathe underwater. When birds passed overhead, casting shadows across her path, she experienced them only as temporary darkening of the sky, threats to be avoided, rather than examples of alternative ways of being. Other caterpillars shared her section of the garden, each following their own version of the same basic pattern. They would occasionally encounter one another on their travels, acknowledge each other with the briefest of gestures, then continue on their separate journeys. There was little communication among them, as their world seemed to offer few topics worthy of extended discussion. Food sources, weather conditions, and danger warnings comprised the extent of their social interaction. One particularly warm afternoon, as Kaya made her way along a rose stem, carefully navigating between thorns that seemed enormous. From her perspective, she encountered something unprecedented. An elderly butterfly had landed on a nearby blossom, her wings spread wide as she fed on the flower's nectar. The butterfly's wingspan was nearly as large as Kaya's entire body, her colors shifting and shimmering in the dappled sunlight. Kaya had seen flying creatures before, but always from a distance and always as potential threats. This was her first close encounter with something so alien to her experience, yet something that seemed peaceful and approachable. The butterfly's movements were graceful and unhurried, suggesting a relationship with the world that was fundamentally different from Kaya's own ground-bound existence. Curiosity overcame caution, and Kaya slowly approached the feeding butterfly. When she was close enough to observe the intricate patterns on the creature's wings, she found the courage to speak. Her question emerged from a longing she had not known she possessed, a yearning for something beyond the endless repetition of her daily routine. The butterfly lifted her head from the flower and regarded Kaya with compound eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience. When she spoke, her voice carried a quality that the caterpillar had never heard before, the sound of someone who had traveled far and seen much, who had gained perspective through transformation rather than mere accumulation of time. The butterfly's response revealed a truth that fundamentally challenged everything Kaya believed about identity and possibility. The revelation that this graceful airborne creature had once been bound to the earth as she was seemed impossible, yet something in the butterfly's manner suggested absolute authenticity. There was no reason for deception, no advantage to be gained from false claims. As Kaya struggled to comprehend this information, the butterfly continued sharing her story. She spoke of the gradual recognition that her life as a caterpillar had been preparation for something beyond her understanding. She described the growing restlessness that had preceded her transformation, the sense that her current form was becoming increasingly inadequate for whatever she was meant to become. The butterfly's account of the cocoon stage was both terrifying and compelling. She spoke of the overwhelming urge to spin herself into darkness, to surrender everything she had known about herself and her capabilities. The process had required absolute trust in something she could not see or understand, faith that dissolution would lead to renewal rather than simply to death. During those days in the cocoon, the butterfly explained she had experienced a complete letting go of her previous identity. Every assumption about who she was and what she was capable of had melted away. There had been moments of terror as familiar structures dissolved, periods of confusion as new forms began to emerge. The darkness had been absolute, the uncertainty overwhelming. Yet, through this process of unknowing, something unprecedented had emerged. The butterfly described the first moments of breaking free from the cocoon, the initial attempts to use wings she had never possessed, before the gradual discovery that the sky was no longer a ceiling, but a medium through which she could move with grace and purpose. Kaya listened to this account with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. The transformation the butterfly described seemed so radical, so complete, that it challenged everything she understood about the nature of existence. How could a creature essentially die to its current form and emerge as something entirely different? How could one surrender everything familiar and trust that something better would emerge from the darkness? As the afternoon progressed, the butterfly shared more details of her aerial existence. She spoke of seeing the garden from above, of understanding for the first time how the various plants and pathways fit together into a larger pattern. She described traveling between gardens, even between regions, following currents of air and instinct to places she had never imagined during her earthbound days. The perspective offered by flight had transformed not just her physical capabilities, but her entire understanding of the world. What had once seemed like enormous obstacles, the gaps between plants, the distances between food sources, had revealed themselves to be minor features in a vast interconnected landscape. The butterfly's ability to move freely through 3 dimensions had opened up possibilities that remained invisible from ground level. When Kaya asked about the specific mechanics of transformation, the butterfly's explanation was both simple and profound. The change, she said, was not something that could be forced or scheduled. It arose naturally when the conditions were right, when the caterpillar had grown to the limits of her current form and was ready to trust in something beyond her comprehension. The key, according to the butterfly, was recognizing when the time had come and not resisting the urge to begin the process. Many caterpillars, she suggested, might ignore or suppress the call to transformation, choosing the familiar discomfort of an outgrown identity over the uncertain promise of metamorphosis. The courage required was not the courage of action, but the courage of surrender. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, the butterfly prepared to continue her journey. Before departing, she offered Kaya a final piece of wisdom. The restlessness that would signal the approach of transformation might feel like dissatisfaction or even despair. The caterpillar might begin to feel that her current way of life was meaningless or insufficient. Rather than seeing these feelings as problems to be solved, they should be recognized as invitations to something greater. After the butterfly's departure, Kaya remained on the rose stem for a long time, processing what she had learned. The conversation had planted seeds of possibility in her consciousness, ideas that would continue to grow and develop over the coming days. She began to pay attention to her internal states in new ways, noticing subtle shifts in her relationship to her familiar routines. In the weeks that followed, Kaya found herself increasingly drawn to quiet contemplation. She would spend long periods motionless on leaves, not feeding, but simply being present to whatever arose in her awareness. Sometimes, she felt stirrings of longing for something she could not name. Moments when her current existence felt like a costume that no longer fit properly. The butterfly's words about trusting the darkness took on new meaning as Kaya began to sense changes in her own body and consciousness. There were days when she felt heavy and sluggish, as if her familiar form was becoming a burden rather than a vehicle for exploration. Other days brought waves of restlessness that could not be satisfied by any amount of movement or feeding. When the time finally came, Kaya recognized it not through dramatic signs or mystical visions, but through a quiet certainty that arose from deep within her being. The urge to find a secure place and begin spinning was not a thought she had, but an instinct that moved through her like gravity or magnetism. She found herself guided to a sheltered spot where the angle of a branch provided both protection and support. The actual process of creating the cocoon required every bit of trust the butterfly had described. Each strand of silk felt like another thread connecting her to an unknown future, another step away from the solid ground of familiar identity. As the walls of her self-made prison grew thicker, Kaya experienced moments of panic alternating with periods of profound peace. Within the darkness of the cocoon, linear time seemed to dissolve. Days and nights became indistinguishable as Kaya's consciousness shifted between states of being she had never experienced before. Sometimes she felt as if she was dissolving, completely losing all sense of boundary between self and surroundings. Other times, she was aware of new structures forming possibilities taking shape in the fluid darkness of transformation. Marcus had been walking for 3 days when he realized he was no longer following any recognizable path. The forest around him had gradually transformed from the familiar oak and pine woodlands near his village into something entirely different, something that defied natural explanation. Every tree trunk had become a perfect mirror, their surfaces so polished and clear that they reflected not the surrounding forest, but only Marcus himself, creating an infinite gallery of his own image, stretching in every direction. At first, Marcus had been merely curious about this strange phenomenon. The mirrors showed him exactly as he appeared, a middle-aged merchant with worry lines etched around his eyes, shoulders slightly hunched from years of carrying heavy packs, clothes dusty from travel. But as he ventured deeper into the forest seeking a way out, the reflections began to change in subtle but disturbing ways. Some mirrors showed him with his face twisted in anger, others revealed expressions of deep sadness he did not remember making, and still others displayed a version of himself that looked frightened and desperate. The realization that these mirrors were reflecting not just his physical appearance, but his inner emotional states filled Marcus with growing unease. He had spent most of his adult life carefully controlling his expressions, maintaining the composed demeanor that served him well in business negotiations and social interactions. To see his hidden feelings displayed so nakedly in these silvered surfaces felt like a violation of his privacy, an exposure of vulnerabilities he had worked hard to conceal. Marcus began walking faster, trying to find a path that would lead him away from these unsettling revelations. But the forest seemed to respond to his distress by becoming more confrontational. The mirrors now showed him versions of himself that he had tried to forget, the young man who had abandoned his artistic ambitions for the security of commerce, the husband who had grown distant from his wife rather than face their problems together, the father who had been too busy building his business to truly know his children. Each reflection was a reminder of choices he had made, roads not taken, relationships he had allowed to wither through neglect or fear. The accumulated weight of these images created a growing panic within Marcus. He broke into a run, desperate to escape the forest and return to the familiar world where he could maintain his carefully constructed facade. But running only made the situation worse, as the mirrors seemed to multiply, and the reflections became increasingly distorted and frightening. The faster Marcus moved, the more chaotic his reflected emotions became. He saw himself screaming with rage at injustices he had been too cowardly to confront, weeping with grief for losses he had never properly mourned, cowering with fear from challenges he had avoided throughout his life. The mirrors were forcing him to confront every emotion he had suppressed, every aspect of himself he had deemed unacceptable or inconvenient. After hours of futile running, Marcus stumbled and fell to his knees beside a small stream that ran through the forest. His legs trembled with exhaustion, his lungs burned from the exertion, and his mind reeled from the emotional assault he had endured. The water was the first normal thing he had encountered in this strange place. flowing clear and untainted by the bizarre mirror phenomenon that surrounded him. As Marcus knelt by the stream, gasping for breath, he caught sight of his reflection in the water. Unlike the mirrors, the water showed him exactly as he was in that moment, exhausted, disheveled, and completely overwhelmed. There was something honest and accepting about this natural reflection that calmed his racing thoughts. The water did not judge or distort. It simply reflected what was present without commentary or enhancement. Gradually, Marcus became aware of his breathing, the way his chest rose and fell with each intake of air. He noticed the sound of the stream, the feeling of moss beneath his knees, the coolness of the air against his skin. These simple physical sensations anchored him in the present moment, providing relief from the emotional chaos that had been building within him. As his panic subsided, Marcus began to consider why the forest had affected him so powerfully. The mirrors had not created the emotions they displayed. They had merely revealed what was already present within him. All his life, he had been carrying these feelings, these suppressed aspects of himself without acknowledging their existence. The forest had simply made visible what had always been there, hidden beneath layers of social conditioning and personal defenses. With this understanding came a different approach to his situation. Instead of trying to escape or deny what the mirrors revealed, Marcus decided to sit quietly and allow whatever emotions arose to be present without resistance. He closed his eyes and took several deep breaths, consciously relaxing the tension he had been holding in his body for so many years. When Marcus opened his eyes, the quality of the reflections had changed dramatically. The mirrors still showed his various emotional states, but now they appeared with a softness and compassion that had been absent before. He saw his anger, but also understood the pain and frustration that lay beneath it. He witnessed his sadness, but recognized it as a natural response to loss and disappointment. His fear was present too, but it no longer seemed overwhelming or shameful. The forest around him seemed to respond to this shift in his inner state. The mirrors became less aggressive in their revelations, showing him not just his struggles, but also his strengths, his capacity for love, his moments of genuine joy and connection. Marcus began to see himself as a complete human being, flawed but also beautiful, struggling but also capable of growth and healing. As he continued walking through the forest, now moving slowly and mindfully rather than rushing in panic, Marcus found that he could look directly at any reflection without being overwhelmed by what it showed him. Each mirror became an opportunity for self-discovery rather than a source of torment. He saw the ways he had hurt others, but also the ways he had helped and supported them. He witnessed his failures, but also his successes, and the lessons he had learned from both. The path through the forest gradually became clearer as Marcus's relationship with his own reflections deepened. He realized that the forest had not been trying to punish or torment him, but rather to offer him the gift of complete self-awareness. By accepting all aspects of himself, both light and shadow, he had found a peace that had eluded him throughout his adult life. When Marcus finally emerged from the forest of mirrors, he was fundamentally changed. The careful masks he had worn for so many years no longer felt necessary or desirable. He had learned that true strength came not from hiding his vulnerabilities, but from acknowledging them with compassion. The forest had taught him that wholeness required embracing every part of himself, not just the parts that society deemed acceptable. In the days and weeks that followed, Marcus found that his relationships with others had been transformed by his journey through the forest. By accepting himself completely, he had become able to see others with the same compassion and understanding. The mirrors had shown him that everyone carries within themselves the full spectrum of human emotion and experience, and that recognizing this common humanity was the foundation of genuine connection and peace. The great bell of Serenity Temple had been cast 300 years earlier during the reign of Emperor Kangxi, when the monastery was first established on the misty slopes of Mount Wutai. The bronze had been mixed with prayers and blessed water from 7 sacred streams, and its voice carried a resonance that seemed to touch something beyond mere sound. For generations, that voice had marked the rhythm of monastic life, calling the community to prayer at dawn and dusk, announcing the changing seasons and providing a sonic anchor for meditation and contemplation. Brother Ananda had been the bell keeper for nearly 2 decades, arriving at the temple as a young novice with calloused hands and a restless spirit. Over the years, he had developed an intimate relationship with the instrument, knowing precisely how to strike it to produce different tones, understanding the subtle variations in its voice, depending on weather, temperature, and the time of day. He could read the bell's moods like an old married couple might read each other's silences, anticipating its needs and responding with the care of a devoted friend. The bell tower stood at the highest point of the temple complex, accessible only by a narrow stone stairway that wound around the building's exterior. Each morning before dawn, Brother Ananda would climb these steps, his breathing synchronized with the rhythm of his footfalls, preparing himself mentally and spiritually for the sacred act of awakening the community. The first strike of the bell each day was more than a signal. It was a prayer, made audible, a call to consciousness that rippled outward through the mountain valleys like drops in a still pond. On the morning of the autumn storm, Brother Ananda sensed something different in the air. As he made his customary ascent, the wind carried an electric charge that made his skin tingle, and the clouds hung low and heavy, pregnant with the promise of violence. He had experienced mountain storms before, but this one felt different, more charged with potential for transformation than mere meteorological disturbance. The bell rang true that morning, its voice carrying clearly despite the gathering wind. But by midday, the storm had arrived with a ferocity that surprised even the mountain-dwelling monks. Rain lashed the temple buildings with horizontal sheets of water, and wind howled through the courtyards with a voice that seemed to come from some primordial chaos. Lightning split the sky repeatedly, each flash illuminating the temple grounds in stark, momentary clarity before plunging everything back into darkness. When the bolt struck the bell tower, the sound was different from thunder. It was a crack that seemed to split the very air, followed by a silence so profound that several monks later described it as hearing the sound of emptiness itself. Brother Ananda, who had been sheltering in the main hall, knew immediately what had happened. Some inner knowledge developed through years of intimate connection with the bell told him that the voice he had tended so carefully had been stilled forever. The damage was extensive but clean. The lightning had struck the bell's rim, creating a crack that ran nearly halfway around its circumference. The bronze had split along lines that followed the metal's internal stresses, creating a fracture that was both destructive and oddly beautiful. When Brother Ananda first examined the broken bell after the storm passed, he felt as if he were looking at a meditation on impermanence made manifest in metal and time. The younger monks gathered around the damaged bell with expressions of genuine distress. Many of them had never lived in a community without the bell's guidance, had never experienced the challenge of maintaining spiritual discipline without external reminders of sacred time. Their concerns were practical, but also deeper. How would they maintain the rhythm of prayer and meditation that had structured their lives since childhood? How would the lay community in the surrounding villages know when to pause their daily labors for moments of mindfulness? Brother Ananda's response surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of immediately discussing repairs or replacement, he suggested that they spend 1 week learning to listen to the silent bell. The phrase emerged from some deeper wisdom than his conscious mind, as if the broken bell itself was speaking through him. He explained that they would observe their normal schedule of prayers and meditation, but without any artificial signals to mark the times. The first day of silence was disorienting for most of the community. Monks found themselves arriving late for meals, missing scheduled work periods, and feeling generally unmoored from the familiar structure that had guided their days. Some compensated by constantly checking the position of the sun or consulting water clocks, creating an artificial replacement for the bell's natural rhythm. Others seemed to drift through the day without any sense of time's passage, arriving at the meditation hall at random intervals and sitting for unpredictable periods. But Brother Ananda had anticipated this initial confusion. He encouraged the community to resist the urge to immediately create new external systems for timekeeping. Instead, he suggested that they pay attention to the subtle cues that had always been present, but often overlooked in favor of the bell's clear call. The changing quality of light throughout the day, the shifting patterns of bird song, the way shadows moved across the courtyard stones. By the third day, something remarkable began to happen. The monks started arriving at the meditation hall within minutes of each other, drawn by some internal sense of timing that seemed to operate below the level of conscious thought. They began to notice that their bodies had natural rhythms that aligned with the traditional prayer times, that hunger arose predictably. At meal times, that fatigue and alertness followed patterns that mirrored the community's ancient schedule. More profound than these practical discoveries was the gradual awakening of a different quality of attention. Without the bell's voice to mark the beginning and end of meditation periods, the monks found that their awareness expanded to encompass subtler phenomena. They became conscious of the sound of their own breathing, the circulation of air through the meditation hall, the distant murmur of wind through pine needles. Some discovered that they could hear their own heartbeat during the deepest periods of stillness. Brother Ananda spent much of that week observing rather than leading. He noticed that the younger monks, initially the most distressed by the bell's silence, were often the quickest to adapt to this new way of being. Their minds seemed more flexible, more capable of finding alternative anchors for attention and awareness. The older monks, including some who had lived at the temple for 40 or 50 years, struggled more with the change, but ultimately developed a deeper appreciation for the subtle teachings that silence could offer. The abbot Venerable Master Huineng used the week of silence as an opportunity to deepen his own understanding of non-attachment. He had been particularly fond of the bell's voice, often timing his personal meditation sessions to coincide with its resonant tones. The forced separation from this familiar support challenged him to find the source of spiritual stability within his own mind, rather than in external conditions. As the week progressed, the entire community began to settle into a different rhythm of life. Conversations became quieter, as if the absence of the bell's voice had made everyone more aware of the impact of sound on consciousness. Footsteps seemed softer work was performed with greater attention to the subtle sounds of tools and materials, and even meals were eaten with increased mindfulness of the sounds of chewing and swallowing. On the seventh day, a delegation of villagers climbed the mountain path to the temple, carrying tools and materials to help with the bell's repair. They had assumed that the monks would be eager to restore their timekeeper as quickly as possible. Instead, they found a community that seemed transformed by the experience of silence, more present and attentive than they had ever observed before. The villagers were invited to join the morning meditation, where they experienced firsthand the profound stillness that had developed during the week of the silent bell. Many later described this as one of the most powerful spiritual experiences of their lives, a taste of the peace that lies beneath the constant noise of daily existence. When the new bell finally arrived several months later, cast by the same foundry that had created the original 3 centuries before the community approached its installation with a different understanding of its role. The bell would be welcomed as a teacher and friend, but not as a master whose voice was essential for spiritual life. They had learned that the call to awakeness could come from anywhere. The mindfulness was not dependent on external cues, but arose from the heart's own capacity for presence and attention. The ceremony for the new bell's blessing was attended by hundreds of people from the surrounding region, many drawn by stories of the week of silence and its transformative effects on the temple community. But even as they celebrated the return of the bell's voice, the monks carried within them the deeper teaching of the silent bell, that true spiritual guidance comes from within, that the most profound teachings are often heard in the spaces between sounds, and that learning to listen deeply is perhaps the most important spiritual skill of all. Hiroshi had been carrying the weight of uncertainty for so long that it had become as much a part of him as his own shadow. Every morning brought fresh anxieties about his struggling business, his aging parents, the possibility of war that seemed to loom ever closer with each passing day. Sleep had become elusive, interrupted by racing thoughts that spiraled through endless scenarios of potential disaster. His shoulders carried the tension of constant vigilance, his jaw remained perpetually clenched, and his stomach churned with the acid of perpetual worry. When his childhood friend Kenji suggested they spend an afternoon by the old river that ran behind their village, Hiroshi agreed reluctantly. He had little time for leisure when so many pressing concerns demanded his attention, but Kenji had been persistent, and something in his friend's manner suggested this was more than a casual invitation. The two men had known each other since boyhood, had shared countless adventures along this same riverbank, but their paths had diverged significantly in recent years. The river had carved its channel through the landscape over countless centuries, wearing smooth the stones that once stood as obstacles, creating pools and eddies that supported life in all its myriad forms. Ancient willows leaned over the water, their trailing branches creating gentle curtains of green that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the surface. The sound of flowing water had remained constant through all the changes that had transformed their village from a simple farming community into something more complex and troubled. Hiroshi arrived at their meeting place with his mind already racing ahead to the evening's obligations. He needed to review the accounts, write letters to potential creditors, prepare for tomorrow's difficult conversation with the landlord. Sitting by a river seemed like an indulgence he could not afford. Yet, something about the steady sound of moving water began to work on his consciousness before he was fully aware of it. Kenji was already there, positioned on a flat stone that had served as their favorite perch during childhood. His posture was relaxed, his breathing, even his attention, fully absorbed by the play of light on water. There was something different about his friend. Hiroshi noticed something that had developed during the months since they had last spent time together. Kenji seemed to carry himself with a quality of ease that Hiroshi envied but could not understand. For the first hour, Hiroshi found it impossible to quiet his restless mind. He would focus on the water for a few moments, then find his attention pulled back to his problems, his fears, his endless mental calculations of what might go wrong and how he might prevent it. His body remained tense despite the peaceful surroundings, his breathing shallow and irregular. The contrast between his own agitation and Kenji's calm presence became increasingly noticeable and somehow embarrassing. When Hiroshi finally voiced his confusion about how anyone could maintain tranquility in such uncertain times, Kenji's response came not in words but in action. He reached for a fallen leaf, one that autumn had painted in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and placed it carefully on the water's surface near the bank. The leaf immediately began to move, caught by currents too subtle for the eye to detect, beginning a journey that would carry it far from its point of origin. The two friends watched in silence as the leaf navigated the complex hydraulics of the river. Sometimes it moved swiftly in the main current, sometimes it paused in quiet eddies. Occasionally it became trapped against a rock or fallen branch before the water's persistent pressure freed it to continue downstream. The leaf never struggled against its circumstances, never fought the current or tried to return to where it had started. It simply moved with whatever forces were acting upon it, adapting to each new situation without resistance. Kenji's quiet explanation of what he had learned from years of observing the river's behavior struck Hiroshi with unexpected force. The metaphor was simple enough to understand intellectually, but its implications challenged everything about how Hiroshi had been approaching his life. He had been fighting against circumstances, like a swimmer battling a riptide, exhausting himself in efforts to control outcomes that were largely beyond his influence. In the days that followed, Hiroshi found himself returning to the river alone, drawn by something he could not quite articulate. He would sit on the same stone where he and Kenji had shared their conversation, watching the endless parade of leaves, twigs, and other debris that the current carried toward the sea. Each object seemed to offer its own lesson in acceptance and flow, demonstrating different ways of moving through obstacles without being destroyed by them. The river's teachings began to infiltrate Hiroshi's daily life in subtle but significant ways. When his largest client cancelled their contract without warning instead of spiraling into panic, he found himself asking what the river would do in similar circumstances. The answer seemed to be find a new path around the obstacle, adapt to the changed conditions, keep moving toward the ultimate destination, even if the route had to be modified. Gradually, Hiroshi began to notice that his relationship with uncertainty was shifting. The anxieties that had once consumed his energy began to feel less solid, less permanent. Like the river itself, his situation was always changing, always moving, never truly static despite his mental attempts to freeze it in place for analysis. This recognition brought a quality of relief he had not experienced in years. The physical symptoms of chronic stress began to ease as Hiroshi learned to apply the river's wisdom to his body as well as his mind. His breathing deepened and slowed following rhythms that seemed to echo the water's movement. His shoulders gradually released their defensive tension, his jaw unclenched. His stomach settled into a more peaceful relationship with whatever he consumed. Sleep returned as his mind learned to flow around worries rather than becoming trapped by them. Months passed, and the seasonal changes along the riverbank provided ongoing instruction in impermanence and adaptation. Spring brought floods that temporarily altered the channel, but the river accommodated these dramatic increases in volume without losing its essential character. Summer brought periods of drought that reduced the flow to a trickle, yet the water continued moving toward its destination, patient and persistent. Autumn filled the water with falling leaves, creating temporary blockages that were gradually dissolved by the current's gentle but inexorable pressure. Hiroshi's business problems had not magically disappeared, but his approach to solving them had been fundamentally transformed. Instead of exhausting himself with futile attempts to control every variable, he focused his energy on responding skillfully to whatever circumstances arose. He became more creative in finding solutions, more flexible in adapting his plans, more confident in his ability to navigate whatever challenges might emerge. The friendship with Kenji deepened as they continued their regular meetings by the river. Their conversations became less frequent but more meaningful, often conducted in comfortable silence that allowed both men to absorb the water's ongoing lessons. They developed a shared vocabulary of understanding that needed few words, a recognition that the river was teaching them both in different ways, according to their individual needs and capacities. Other villagers began to notice the changes in Hiroshi's demeanor and approach to life's challenges. Some sought his advice, curious about how he had learned to remain calm in situations that would have previously sent him into spirals of anxiety. He found himself sharing the river's teachings not through formal instruction, but through example demonstrating what it looked like to flow with circumstances rather than against them. The river had become more than a geographical feature. It had become a living teacher, a constant reminder that peace could be found not in controlling life's currents, but in learning to move with them skillfully and gracefully. Hiroshi's understanding continued to deepen with each visit, each observation, each moment of allowing the water's wisdom to inform his choices and responses. In a remote coastal village, where the sea met jagged cliffs and endless storms tested the resilience of both man and stone, an old lighthouse keeper named Taro had devoted over 50 years of his life to a single unwavering purpose. Each evening, as darkness gathered over the waters, he would climb the spiral stone steps to the lantern room and kindle the great beacon that had guided countless vessels safely through treacherous waters. Each dawn, he would extinguish the flame, clean the lens, and prepare for another night of vigilant service. The lighthouse stood on a promontory that jutted into the sea like a defiant finger pointing toward the horizon. Waves crashed against its base with relentless fury during storms, sending spray high into the air, but the structure had weathered every assault for over a century. Taro had become as much a part of this enduring monument as the stones themselves, his daily rituals woven into the fabric of the lighthouse's existence, with such consistency that the local fishermen could set their clocks by his movements. His life had settled into rhythms that mirrored the natural world around him. Rising before dawn, he would walk the perimeter of the lighthouse grounds, checking for storm damage, clearing debris, and maintaining the various mechanisms that kept the beacon operational. These morning inspections were conducted in complete silence, his footsteps the only sound besides the constant murmur of waves against stone. Over the decades, he had learned to read the subtle signs that predicted Weather changes the way gulls behaved before storms, the particular quality of light that preceded fog, the direction of wind shifts that announced clearing skies. The villagers regarded Taro with a mixture of respect and gentle puzzlement. His dedication to duty was absolute, even as the world beyond their small community had changed dramatically. Ships now carried sophisticated navigation equipment, weather forecasting had become precise and reliable, and the old lighthouse had been officially decommissioned years earlier. Yet Taro continued his vigil, maintaining the light with his own resources, convinced that its purpose transcended mere maritime navigation. When younger villagers questioned the necessity of his work, Taro would simply gesture toward the beacon and continue his tasks without explanation. He understood something that could not be easily articulated. The lighthouse served a purpose that extended beyond the practical into the realm of symbol and meaning. It represented constancy in an uncertain world, hope in the face of darkness, and the power of human commitment to transcend immediate circumstances. On this particular stormy night, as wind howled around the lighthouse with unusual ferocity and rain lashed the windows with stinging intensity, Taro was conducting his evening ritual when he heard desperate knocking at the door below. A young sailor named Kenji had somehow managed to reach shore in a small fishing boat, his vessel battered by waves and his body exhausted from fighting the storm. Water streamed from his clothes as he stumbled into the lighthouse's base, seeking shelter from the tempest that continued to rage outside. Taro descended from the lantern room to find the young man shivering and disoriented, his eyes wide with the terror of someone who had faced death and barely escaped. Without hesitation, the lighthouse keeper provided dry clothes, hot tea, and a place by the small stove that heated the ground floor. He asked no questions about how Kenji had come to be caught in such a storm, offering instead the silent comfort of practical care and human presence. As the night progressed and the storm continued its assault on the coastline, Kenji's initial shock gave way to deep gratitude and then to curiosity about his rescuer. He observed Taro's movements throughout the lighthouse, noting the careful attention paid to every detail, the way each task was performed with the same methodical precision regardless of the chaos raging outside. When exhaustion finally allowed the young sailor to speak coherently, his question emerged from a place of genuine wonder and need. Taro's response came not through words, but through action and presence. He led Kenji up the spiral staircase to the lantern room, where the great lens focused the beacon's light into a powerful beam that swept across the turbulent waters. The sight was magnificent and humbling, the relatively small flame magnified and directed outward, cutting through darkness and spray to create a visible pathway through chaos. Standing in the presence of this light, surrounded by the sound of wind and rain, but sheltered within the lighthouse's solid walls, Taro began to share the understanding that had sustained him through decades of solitary service. The lighthouse, he explained, operated on a principle that applied to human existence as surely as it applied to maritime navigation. The beacon did not attempt to calm the storm or alter the fundamental nature of the sea. It simply maintained its position and purpose, offering guidance to anyone who needed to find their way. This revelation struck Kenji with unexpected force. Throughout his young life, he had approached challenges with the assumption that success meant controlling outcomes, defeating obstacles, and imposing his will upon circumstances. The lighthouse keeper's perspective suggested an entirely different way of being in the world, maintaining inner stability while allowing external conditions to flow and change according to their own nature. As the storm gradually subsided and dawn approached, Taro shared more of the wisdom he had accumulated during his years of service. He spoke of nights when the storm had been so fierce that maintaining the light seemed impossible, yet somehow the beacon had continued to shine. He described occasions when he had doubted the value of his work, wondered if anyone even noticed his efforts, only to later receive word of lives saved and disasters averted through the lighthouse's guidance. These stories revealed the deeper teaching embedded in Taro's life, the importance of faithfulness to purpose, regardless of external validation or immediate results. The lighthouse keeper had learned to find meaning not in dramatic rescues or public recognition, but in the daily practice of showing up, maintaining standards, and offering whatever assistance his position allowed. His contentment came from alignment with a purpose larger than personal ambition or temporary comfort. Kenji listened to these teachings with the intensity of someone receiving instruction that could transform his understanding of life itself. The lighthouse keeper's example challenged him to reconsider his own relationship to difficulty and uncertainty. Instead of viewing challenges as problems to be eliminated, he began to see them as conditions that called forth different qualities of response: patience instead of force, presence instead of escape, steadiness instead of reactivity. When morning finally arrived and the storm had passed, leaving the sea calm and the air clear, Kenji prepared to return to his village. His boat had been damaged but was still seaworthy, and the peaceful conditions would allow for safe passage. As he prepared to depart, he found himself profoundly changed by his night at the lighthouse. The terror and desperation that had driven him to seek shelter had been replaced by a quiet confidence and sense of purpose. Taro watched the young sailor navigate his boat away from the lighthouse with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride or self-congratulation. He had done what lighthouses do, provided guidance and shelter when they were needed most. The interaction had required no special effort or dramatic gesture, only the consistent maintenance of his light and his willingness to share shelter with someone in need. In the days that followed, word of Kenji's experience spread throughout the coastal communities. Other young people began making pilgrimages to the lighthouse, drawn by stories of the keeper's wisdom and the transformative power of his simple presence. Taro welcomed them all with the same quiet hospitality he had shown Kenji, never making grand pronouncements or claiming special knowledge, but simply demonstrating through his daily actions what it meant to live with purpose and constancy. These visitors came seeking answers to questions they could barely articulate: how to find meaning in ordinary work, how to maintain hope during difficult times, how to be helpful to others without losing themselves in the process. They found in Taro's example a different model of strength and success, one based not on accumulation or achievement, but on steady service and quiet presence. In the mountains of northern Japan, where winters stretched long and harsh and growing seasons were brief and precious, lived a master gardener named Yoshiro, who had devoted his entire adult life to understanding the mysteries of cultivation and growth. His garden occupied a small valley protected from the worst winds by ancient cedar trees, and every square meter had been planned and planted with the kind of attention that comes only from decades of patient observation and experimentation. Yoshiro had arrived in this remote location as a young man fleeing the disappointments of city life, carrying nothing but basic tools and a small collection of seeds inherited from his grandmother. The land he chose seemed inhospitable to most forms of agriculture, rocky and steep with soil that had been depleted by centuries of erosion. But something in the isolation and challenge of the place appealed to his temperament, and he began the slow work of transformation that would occupy the rest of his life. The first years had been brutal, filled with failures that would have discouraged a less determined person. Seeds rotted in soil that retained too much moisture or dried out too quickly. Seedlings were destroyed by late frosts, summer droughts, or the sudden storms that swept through the mountains without warning. Yoshiro learned through these disasters, adjusting his methods, experimenting with different locations within his small valley, gradually developing an intimate understanding of the microclimates and seasonal patterns that governed his chosen domain. By his 10th year in the mountains, Yoshiro had achieved a modest success. His vegetables grew reliably enough to feed him through the winters, and his flowers provided beauty during the brief growing season. But he had also begun to develop a deeper understanding of gardening that transcended mere survival or aesthetics. He started to see his work as a form of meditation, a practice that taught him as much about patience and acceptance as it did about horticulture. It was during this period of growing expertise that Yoshiro encountered the teaching that would transform his understanding not just of gardening, but of life itself. While cleaning out an old storage building that had come with his property, he discovered a small wooden box containing seeds that appeared to have been stored for many years. Most were too old to be viable, but among them he found 2 specimens that intrigued him. Both appeared to be from the same plant species, but one was significantly larger than the other. Without knowing exactly what these seeds might grow into, Yoshiro decided to plant them side by side in a prepared bed that received morning sunlight and afternoon shade. He treated them identically, providing the same soil, the same amount of water, the same protection from pests and weather. This would be an experiment in allowing natural processes to unfold without interference or favoritism. The larger seed responded immediately to the spring warmth and moisture. Within days, a green shoot pushed through the soil surface, and within weeks the plant had developed several sets of leaves and was growing with obvious vigor. Visitors to Yoshiro's garden invariably commented on this healthy young plant, praising its rapid development and predicting a spectacular flowering. The smaller seed, however, showed no signs of life whatsoever. Week after week passed with no visible change in the soil above it. Some of Yoshiro's neighbors, practical farming people who measured success by tangible results, began to suggest that he was wasting valuable garden space on what was obviously a dead seed. They offered to bring him replacement plants, arguing that his experiment had clearly failed and it was time to move on to more promising possibilities. Yoshiro listened to these suggestions with his characteristic politeness, but made no changes to his care of either plant. He had learned through years of gardening that appearance could be deceptive, that some of his most spectacular successes had begun with the most unpromising circumstances. More importantly, he had developed a philosophy of gardening that valued process over results, understanding over control. The fast-growing plant continued to thrive through the early weeks of summer, developing a robust stem and healthy foliage that seemed to promise an impressive flowering. Yoshiro noted its progress with satisfaction, but without the attachment that had characterized his earlier gardening efforts. He had learned that premature celebration of apparent success often led to disappointment, that gardens had their own timing that could not be rushed or predicted with certainty. As summer progressed and the mountain weather became more challenging with sudden temperature changes and unpredictable storms, the fast-growing plant began to show signs of stress. Its rapid early development had apparently come at the cost of root stability and structural strength. Wind damage became frequent, requiring regular staking and support. The plant's vigorous early growth seemed to have made it vulnerable to exactly the kinds of challenges that mountain gardens regularly faced. Meanwhile, the space above the slow seed remained unchanged. Yoshiro continued his daily care routine, watering the area and protecting it from weeds, but visitors increasingly questioned his persistence with what seemed to be an obvious failure. Some suggested that his attachment to this dead seed revealed a lack of practical wisdom, an inability to accept reality and move forward with more productive activities. Yoshiro's response to these criticisms revealed the depth of his gardening philosophy. He explained that true gardening required a different relationship to time than most human activities. Seeds operated according to their own internal schedules, responding to combinations of conditions that might not be immediately apparent to human observation. His role was not to impose his timeline on natural processes, but to create and maintain conditions that would allow whatever was possible to unfold in its own way and time. The turning point came during a particularly severe storm in late summer. Wind and hail damaged many plants throughout the valley, and Yoshiro's fast-growing specimen was among the casualties. Despite all his care and support, the plant's rapid early development had left it structurally weak, unable to withstand the force of the mountain weather. It broke at ground level, its promising early growth ending in complete destruction. That same storm, however, brought exactly the combination of moisture and soil disturbance that the dormant seed had been waiting for. Within days of the storm's passing, a small green shoot appeared above the previously empty soil. The emergence was subtle, easy to miss among the general recovery activity throughout the garden, but Yoshiro noticed it immediately and watched its subsequent development with fascination. The plant that emerged from the patient seed grew slowly, but with obvious strength and purpose. Its root system developed extensively before much energy went into above-ground growth, creating a foundation that could support whatever structure would eventually emerge. The leaves were smaller than those of its predecessor, but thicker and more resilient, adapted to withstand the challenges of the mountain environment. As autumn progressed, this patient plant continued its steady development, showing none of the vulnerability that had characterized the earlier specimen. When the first frost arrived, ending the growing season for most plants in the garden, the slow growth plant seemed barely affected, its hardy constitution allowing it to continue photosynthesis well into the winter months. By the following spring, it had become clear that Yoshiro's patience had been rewarded with something extraordinary. The plant had developed into a magnificent perennial with a root system so extensive and well established that it could support dramatic seasonal growth. When flowering time arrived, the display was spectacular, with blossoms that covered the entire plant and attracted beneficial insects from throughout the valley. More impressive than the plant's beauty, however, was its resilience and longevity. Year after year, it returned with increasing vigor, becoming a stable anchor for Yoshiro's garden design and a source of seeds for future plantings. Its success demonstrated principles that extended far beyond horticulture into the realm of life philosophy. Yoshiro began sharing the story of the two seeds with the increasing number of visitors who sought him out for gardening advice. The tale became a teaching tool that illustrated the difference between superficial progress and genuine development between immediate gratification and lasting achievement. Many who heard the story found applications in their own lives, recognizing parallels between the patient seed's approach and their own struggles with career development, relationships, or spiritual growth. The garden itself became a living laboratory for studying the principles that the two seeds had illustrated. Yoshiro continued experimenting with different approaches to cultivation, always guided by the understanding that authentic growth could not be rushed, that the most valuable developments often happened out of sight, and that apparent failure might simply be preparation for eventual success that exceeded all expectations. Visitors often left Yoshiro's mountain garden with more than gardening tips or flower seeds. They carried with them a different understanding of time and growth, appreciation for the hidden work that precedes visible achievement, and a renewed faith in the value of patience as an active and intelligent response to life's uncertainties. As our journey through these sacred stories draws to a peaceful close, may you carry within your heart the gentle wisdom they have shared. Like seeds planted in the fertile soil of consciousness, these ancient teachings will continue to grow and bloom in the quiet moments of your daily life, offering guidance when the path seems unclear and comfort when the world feels overwhelming. Each parable has whispered its own truth that peace is not a destination to be reached, but a quality of being to be cultivated. That wisdom often wears the simple clothes of everyday experience, and that the most profound transformations happen not through force, but through patient surrender to the natural rhythms of growth and change. Tonight, as you prepare to rest, remember that you are like the patient seed, carrying within yourself everything needed for your own beautiful unfolding. Trust in the darkness of sleep. As the caterpillar trusts in her cocoon, knowing that rest is not emptiness, but preparation, not ending, but renewal. Let your dreams be touched by the flowing wisdom of the river, the steady light of the lighthouse, and the mirror-like clarity of still water reflecting infinite sky. The stories you have heard tonight are now part of you, woven into the fabric of your being like golden threads in a tapestry. They will work within you as you sleep, bringing their healing presence to places that words alone cannot reach, teaching your spirit the art of flowing with life rather than against it. May your sleep be as deep and restorative as the earth's embrace of the patient seed. May your dreams carry the lightness of the butterfly's wings and the steadiness of the lighthouse keeper's flame. May you awaken tomorrow with a heart as clear as the mountain stream and as spacious as the sky reflected in still water. Rest now in the knowledge that you are held by the same infinite wisdom that guides the river to the sea, that turns the seasons, and that brings each dawn after the darkest night. You are part of this greater flow, this eternal dance of rest and renewal, of sleeping and waking, of planting and flowering. Sweet dreams, dear traveler. Until we meet again in this sanctuary of story and silence, may peace be your companion and wisdom your guide. Sleep well, knowing that each ending's also a beginning, and that tomorrow's light is already growing in the depths of tonight's rest. With gratitude for the privilege of sharing these timeless teachings, and with wishes for your deepest peace and most gentle dreams,